Hello guys, so welcome back to another video. Today we're going to look at functions and how we define them and how we use them. So we can start by a function with the return values. So to define a function in Go, you definitely start with this function func key, and then you define the name of your function, and then the parameters, and then the return value. Of course, the data type. So in our case, you're going to define a function that add two integers. So we're just going to say func add the name, and then we have the first value a, then we have b, the second value, and then since you're going to return an integer, I just come here and say return value is going to be that, and then we're going to return a plus b. So we can use our function here and maybe say 1 plus 5, and then we say add, and then we say 1 5. Then we can run this and see that it works. As you can see, it's working. So you can just maybe say you can add, let's say maybe an equal here, that we have 1 plus 5. Of course, it's going to be 6. Another function that we can define is a function maybe has multiple return value. In this case here, we just have only one return value. So we can define a function with multiple return values, so we can define a function that is going to return two values. In our case, we can maybe add create a function that returns that divides two numbers. So you can just maybe say func, then we divide. We're going to divide two numbers. Of course, we're going to have a numerator and a denominator, and you can say maybe both of them are float. Now another thing I've just remembered, since we have these two have to have one data type, we can just combine them so that we have a, b, int. You don't have to repeat that. And then we have the numerator and the denominator, and then the return value, you're going to return that and a string. So in our case, you're going to have multiple variables. This is going to be a response of this, and then we can return something else here, and then we can come and say if maybe the denominator, so that we can handle special cases whereby we have maybe undefined, because zero can define any number divided by 0. So if you're going to return that, you can maybe return 0 with an error. You just say error division by 0. Of course, in maths that doesn't happen. Otherwise, we're just going to return 2, because we're returning 2, the result of this and our value. So it's going to be numerator divided by the denominator, and then we can maybe return a string. So this is how you define multiple return values. You define your function, and then these are going to be multiple. As you can see, you're returning a single integer value. That's why you have only int here, and then we are returning a float and a string. So to use this in a real example, just come here. We just come and say results, and then maybe the message. Of course, you can call it anything you want, and then you're going to say divide. Maybe you can say maybe the numerator is going to be maybe 10, the denominator is going to be 2. So to use this, you can just come down here and maybe copy this. You can copy that, and then we say maybe 10 divided by 2. And then we're just going to come here. Now, since we've already done our division, you can just capture these values here, the result and the message. So we can just come and say is equal to, then we return the result, and then we can add this one as well and say maybe message, then we return the message. Then we can run this, then you can see that 10 divided by 2 is 5, the message is success. Of course, you can return whatever you want here, and then maybe you can handle it maybe with care. We can maybe try doing this with 0, then it returns an error because it returns a 0 because you're told this to return a 0, and then it runs a mentions error division by 0. And then another function that you can define is going to be a function that accepts unlimited number of arguments. Of course, as you can see here, ours is limited to only 2. This one is also limited to 2. So we can say function with multiple arguments, function with multiple arguments, and then we can say maybe func. We can define a function that returns the sum of a limited number of numbers. So you can just say sum, and then you can just say nums. And of course, they're going to be integers. Of course, you can use float, and the answer is going to be integer form. So in our case, for us to do, we can provide unlimited number of integers, and then we get the sum of them. So of course, we have to define a total variable here, initialized to 0, and then we can just use a very simple for loop here. And then we define the num. You can use a range arranging through the supplied nums. And then for every number we're going to add total, because the initially that was 0, and then we're going to return the total. It's as simple as that. So to use this one, we're just going to come down here, and then we're going to use our function. So you can just copy this here, and then we're going to say maybe sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you can say sum 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, here you can pass as many numbers as you want. Yes, we can do that. Then you can run it. Should be able the sum of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is 15. So we can add as many numbers as we want here. It's going to be unlimited. So that is how you create a function that has multiple arguments. Now, another function type of function that we can create a function that returns another function. And this is how you can define it. Or before we look at that, we can maybe create a function that has a return value. No, that has a variable. You can define a variable for function. And of course, there are various ways you can do this. You can define a variable, like as we did previously. You can define a variable and then you prefill it depending on that's something you can use in multiple functions or in multiple files, especially when you're doing, let's say, a login. You want to capture the user ID. You can define a function like the user ID, and then you prefill it when somebody logs in. So the same thing, you can define a variable function and then you prefill it with the depending on whatever operation you want to do. So you're going to define a function that has a variable assigned to it. So you can just say function assigned a variable. So you can maybe say var multiply. Var multiply is going to be a func, and then we're going to pass our variables here. Of course, we can just maybe say ab int, of course with a return variable of int, just an example, and then maybe we can return a multiplied by b. So of course, to use this one, you just copy this. You can just copy it. You can just use this one here. Then maybe we say 2 times 5, and then you just come and say here multiply to 5. That should give us 10. You can add an equal sign here. Add some space in there, and then you just do that. So it's going to be 2 times 5. It's going to be 10. Of course, you can add 20 there, and then you test it out. That you have your very simple function. Now another thing we can maybe define is a function that returns another function that returns other function. In some cases you might want to create a function that returns another function. Of course, when you're doing applications, that's when you get to encounter such scenarios, and they tend to help you a lot. So we can define a function called maybe multiplier. This function is going to return another function whereby you multiply a number by a given factor. So you can define the factor here, and then of course the factor is going to be an integer, and in our case it's going to return a function. That is, the return value is going to be a function, is going to be an integer. And then we're going to return that integer func int. Then we're going to return a func, which is going to be an integer. And then that integer is going to return maybe I multiplied by the factor. So this function returns a function that's going to multiply the value that you pass on it with this factor here. So to use this kind of function, it has various processes. You have to first define your multiplier, because we have to first define this multiplier with a factor, and then we can use this inner function to multiply it with that particular factor. So you first define it here. You can maybe say times 3. Of course, we're going to define a factor of 3. Then we define our multiplier, we pass in our factor, and then to get the answer, we just come and we can just take this, and then we paste it, and then we can just say maybe we can say 3 multiplied by something like 7, and then we come and use the variable we just defined. Of course, now this times 3 is also a function, so we just need to pass our multiplier, which is going to be 7, and then we can run that. So this is going to be our factor, and this is going to be our I, as we have defined it here. So this is how you return a function, and then you use the function. Of course, you have to define this so that you can use this in a function, the function that you are returning. And then one last thing that we can look at is maybe recursion functions. Of course, this is a function within itself, and then we can just do this by using this recursion. Then we say func, maybe factorial, the most common approach. Then we say maybe int, and then of course you're going to return an integer. And then you can come and say if n equals to 0, just going to return 1. Of course, to learn more about recursion, you can just get a lot of explanations online, and then you can say n multiplied by the factorial of n minus 1, and then you can come and use it here and say maybe you want to get the factorial of, just copy that, and then maybe you want to get the factorial of something like 5. Because you come and say factorial of 5, and then you're going to get 120. So guys, these are the various ways you can use to define a function. Just to do a recap, you define a function using the func key and then the name of your function, and then you define your parameters and the return value. In this case, we are returning one value, a plus b. Then you just also do the same here, but the difference case is that here we're returning two return values, the float 64 and the string. And for you to be able to use this, you also have to supply two return values, otherwise it will throw an error. And then you also defined a function sum that can sum an infinite number of arguments, so that you can add, you can supply 2, you can supply 10, you can supply 20, but it will be able to calculate the total of all and return an integer value. Then you also defined a function whereby you define it with a variable, because the rest you didn't add any variable, but in this case you can define a variable and then assigning it to a function, and then you can still use it. Another thing is you can define a function that returns a function on its own, and you have to take note of this, because if you don't supply this, is going to throw in an error because your return value is returning a function. So even if I returned a string here, it will also throw an error. That's how good Go is. And then we also have recursion, whereby we define the recursion algorithm. Of course, we can just do this using a function within itself, and then you return the value. So guys, that's all we can discuss about functions. So see you in the next video.